Greetings to the brightest audience in the country, and welcome to the Dominic Enyart Show. We are nearing the end of our little mini-series here, Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as an evangelical Christian, I feel called to share the message of the Bible with the world, the good news of the Bible with the world. And there are a lot of defenses of the Bible, its historic claims. We can look at archaeology and we can look at astronomy and help prove the Bible that way. And we've been covering just the tiniest little bit of that in our Worldview series, which we've been going through on the Dominic Enyart Show. But there is one specific issue, one specific topic within the giant umbrella of Christianity that is a shortcut right to the heart of the issue, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Christ did not rise from the dead, then Christianity is false. We of all men are the most pitiable, and Jesus died for nothing. Yet Christ did rise from the dead, so Christianity is true, and we have been granted everlasting life. If you want to try and disprove Christianity, if you can't stand those obnoxious Christians who meet on Sundays down at their cultish church and they sing all those cultish songs about some dude who died 2,000 years ago, and you just want to show up and just show how everything that they believe is false, you can disprove the evidence that Jesus died and rose from the dead. That is where you should begin your crusade against Christianity. Go into it, look at it carefully, and disprove every single piece of evidence. If you want to disprove Christianity and strike a serious blow against Jesus, start here. Start with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, this is my way of reaching out to critics of Christianity, because I think the very best way to become a Christian is to consider the evidence about the resurrection of Jesus. And it is so overwhelming that even if you go in with a very critical mindset and you look at the evidence for this, I think there is a good chance you will be persuaded that Christianity is true, even if you go in with the mindset of, I want to go and disprove this. Now, of course, you'd still need enough humility to submit before the truth, and humility, eating humble pie, is never a fun thing. And of course, pride is the main thing that keeps people away from Christ. And so today I would like to encourage the listener and the viewer, now that we are here on YouTube, to suspend your pride for the next half hour here and consider the evidence very carefully. Today I'm going to start off by listing some historical facts which are largely agreed on. And these facts, to get these facts, you don't have to go to a Jewish rabbi, you don't have to go to a pastor, you don't have to go to, www.christian.com. You don't have to go to a conservative commentator, anything like that. To get these facts I'm about to list you can find them by going to the most liberal, anti-Christian, secular, historical scholars you can find. My goal here is to form somewhat of a baseline that we can use, both believer and unbeliever alike. And I want some common ground that we can share to begin to study this issue, this question: did Jesus rise from the dead? And now, when I say all parties can agree on these facts, which I'm going to list, I mainly mean all scholarly parties. Of course, there's the typical atheist seething in the YouTube comment section. That's kind of the stereotype that say, Jesus never existed. And to those atheists, I'm not going to try to address silliness like that here today, but I want to form common ground with the mainstream secular scholarly historians and the secular scholars. And by the way, the content in today's show, it was largely inspired by William Lane Craig. I'll link to his video on this. He is absolutely awesome. He goes into a lot more depth on some of these points and a lot less on some of the other points. And so it's worth checking him out, checking out his video on this, which I'll link to in the description. And I'm going to be echoing many of his points here today in this Evidence That Jesus Rose series that we're in the middle of. I don't mean to take credit for these evidences. I didn't come up with all of these just on my own, but rather I just want to compile and present them and make them easily accessible and easily digestible. And so credit to Craig, who is just brilliant. Again, I'll link to his video in the description. Make sure to check that out. And so what are some things agreed on by all scholarly parties? What are some things about this topic that everyone agrees on? Well, number one, that after Jesus' crucifixion, he was buried in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. The Sanhedrin, if you're not familiar, it was a council of Jewish elders. This was the Jewish leadership of the time, and they held a degree of both political and religious power. And if you recall, it was the Sanhedrin who condemned Jesus and sent him to the Romans to be punished and executed. Now, within this group of elders, there was two levels of power, similar to how Congress has the Senate and the House, and the both of them make up the Congress. There was the lesser Sanhedrin and the greater Sanhedrin, and both of those together made up just the Sanhedrin. And so Joseph of Arimathea, it seems, was part of the greater Sanhedrin. Being part of the Sanhedrin at any level would make you noteworthy, but especially if you were in the upper section, the upper group. And it seems that Joseph of Arimathea was from the historical accounts that we have. And so this guy, he buried Jesus. He asked for Jesus' body, and he wanted to bury him in his own tomb. Now, this is an important detail because as a prominent and noteworthy figure, Joseph of Arimathea, when Jesus was buried, because Joseph of Arimathea was the guy who buried Jesus, it was well known by all Jerusalem, both Jew and Christian alike. They all knew where Jesus was buried because this prominent and wealthy man was saying, I'm going to bury this guy. Kind of be like if Elon Musk said, someone just died, I'm going to bury him here. We would all know about it. The location of his tomb is well known, or it was well known at the time. That is why this point is important. And New Testament scholars, they believe this because of the following evidence. A, there are multiple early independent sources that attest to Jesus' burial. Now, there's a claim that the amount of time that has passed means that we cannot trust this evidence. I'd like to point out that time does not cause good evidence to then become bad evidence. Now, if there's a significant amount of time between when an event happened and then after that, and then when that event was recorded, it is true that that record becomes less compelling. It becomes less compelling evidence. But if an event happens and then it is recorded immediately, and then much time passes after that, that evidence is still just as compelling. And as I said, there are multiple early independent records of Jesus' burial. For example, we read a few shows back a passage that was either created by Paul or perhaps Paul was quoting it when he wrote his first letter to the church in Corinth. He says, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. And so Cephas, that's another name for Peter. But scholars, they have believed that this idea, this tradition which Paul was quoting, first originated only 5 years after the death and burial of Jesus. In historical accounts, in historical terms, that is absolute gold. If you are a historian, finding something that near to the time of an event is wonderful, especially for that time period. Keep in mind that there is a secular historian by the name of Josephus, and this dude, he wasn't a Christian, and he recorded the fall of Jerusalem, like in Jeremiah's time, and which that happened like maybe 500, 600 years before Josephus was even born. And secular historians, they place a incredible amount of trust in Josephus records. And so they trust a record which was made hundreds of years later for the fall of Jerusalem. And here we have something that is just 5 years after Jesus' birth. This is, from a historian's perspective, this is absolute gold. And then B, the burial account, how Joseph buried Jesus, is part of very old source material used by Mark in his gospel. And when you read the 4 Gospels, they consist of many accounts of Jesus' life. Some records here and there, which kind of give us a little peek into who Jesus was. And they aren't all listed in chronological order, which makes sense. And you could almost picture that, right? Let's say there's someone you love, and Mark and the authors of the gospel, they love Jesus. And so let's say that there's someone who you love, and if that person were to die, you might want to write everything that they did, because you don't want to forget it. You want to remember something. And so you remember something and you write it down. You remember something else and you write it down. And I decided to do this when my dad died. I keep a note, and every time a noteworthy memory comes to mind, I always, jot it down. And all of my notes, they are all true. I don't write these things down for other people. I write them down mainly for myself. And I'm not trying to form any sort of fake narrative that will be seen by others later. I'm just writing it down as it comes to me because I want to have a record of this. And before the show here, as I was preparing, I glanced at that note, and I went through all the little notes I wrote and all the little stories I wrote, and none of it was written. I didn't write any of it in chronological order. And that's about what we would expect of the Gospels too. These authors are much more personal than we give them credit for. When I write notes about my dad, all the memories, they kind of just start flooding in, and I write things down as fast as I can, but I remember things faster than I can even write them down, and inevitably, I just say, I can't write them all. I just can't, because I gotta go to work or whatever it is, so I just don't write those down. And that's human nature to be like that. And that's exactly what we see in John, for example. He says about Jesus, he says, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." And that adds up. That makes perfect sense. That's the attitude and exhaustion we'd expect from someone trying to record the history of someone's life, especially someone so noteworthy as Jesus Christ. But getting back on topic, the 4 Gospels have accounts of various events in Jesus' life, various things happening all surrounding this one guy, all surrounding Jesus Christ, and not always in chronological order, which is what we would expect. But when we come to the account of Jesus' suffering and his death, we do have one smooth, continuously running account, one continuously running chronological narrative. And that is about the last week of Jesus' life. And this narrative, this historical account of this week, is known as the Passion Story. That is what this is referred to as. In the Gospel of Mark, scholars believe that this was the earliest of the 4 Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, and as well as the other 3 Gospels, they all refer back to this Passion Story. And so we have both sides. We both have this passion story that was going around before even Mark wrote his gospel. We have that, and we have the tradition which we see from Paul, both of which are early independent records that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. And this was well known at the time. And this is clear. And then another piece of evidence we have for this, that he was buried by this member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, is that as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, they were the people who, the Jewish council, they were the Jewish council who condemned Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea cannot be a Christian invention. It just does not add up. If you are familiar with Christian history, the Christians, right after the time of Jesus' death, they were furious with the Jewish leadership for their role in the execution of Christ. Now, unfortunately, that fury was carried until even recently with Luther in the Reformation, who was wildly wicked and anti-Semitic. He hated the Jews for what they did to Christ, and he was unwilling to recognize the Christian teaching that the Jews will be redeemed, and they will be redeemed, which is awesome, and praise God for that. Now, there are many Christians in especially those in like the James White type circles, who try to defend Luther with every fiber of their being. And these Christians make me very angry. Luther was a seething racist who should be seen as such, most notably with his book titled On the Jews and Their Lies. And so Luther is not deserving of praise, but of scorn. Regardless, we see the roots of his anti-Semitism in the early church among the early Christians who, ethnically, they were Jews themselves, but they were frustrated with the Jewish leadership. In Christian eyes, the Sanhedrin organized essentially a political and judicial assassination of Jesus. And so these early Christians, they were not fans of the Sanhedrin, so it makes absolutely zero sense that these Christians would pretend one of their members of the Sanhedrin was willing to go out of their way to perform this extremely kind and generous act for Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea, he was very wealthy, and he was building an extremely expensive tomb for himself and his family to be buried in. Yet when Christ died, Joseph, he asked for Jesus' body so Jesus might be buried in his expensive tomb rather than just being buried like a criminal. And so Joseph of Arimathea wanted to give him a proper and significant, impactful burial. And this was a huge sacrifice for Joseph, both financially and socially. The Jews of the Sanhedrin, the council that he was part of, they would be mad at him for this. And he could no longer use the tomb for himself and his family. And of course, tombs at that time and in that time period, they were much more culturally significant. And because your lineage, that was such a big part of your culture. And so having a big tomb to preserve your history, that was very important. Yet Joseph of Arimathea, he was willing to sacrifice that of himself for Jesus Christ. And this was a big sacrifice to make. And so, because of that, it makes zero sense for Christians to make up a lie about how one of their enemies was willing to do this really awesome, wonderful thing for them. It would be like Donald Trump lying and saying that Joe Biden gave him a campaign donation. And it would be like Trump saying how much he loves Joe Biden. It would just never happen. Trump would never lie about such a thing because they are enemies. And Trump, he would never give Biden any form of false, fake props that he's just lying about. The only conceivable way that Donald Trump might ever say something positive about Biden is that maybe if Biden actually did something positive, Trump would never lie and give Biden fake props. And so too with the early Christians and the Jewish Sanhedrin, the early Christians would never have made up a lie, a positive lie about Joseph of Arimathea. And this just goes to show that this Joseph character, it cannot be a Christian invention. And then to wrap it up, no other competing burial account even exists, let alone challenges the story of Joseph of Arimathea. If the burial in Joseph's tomb, if that were fake, if that were fictitious, we would at least find a competing story of the burial of Jesus' body. Yet we find nothing, not even a trace. Yet all of our sources, they all point to the honorable burial of Jesus in the tomb that was originally going to be for Joseph of Arimathea. So that's number one. The second thing that everybody agrees on is on the Sunday morning following Jesus' burial, his tomb was found empty by female followers. Keep in mind, this isn't simply Christian dogma that I'm spouting. This is agreed on by anti-Christian secular historians. There are 5 main lines of evidence that cause even skeptics to accept the fact that the tomb was found empty, as the Bible records. A, the historicity of the burial account supports the empty tomb. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does the burial account, how does that support the evidence? How does that support the existence of an empty tomb? How does that go to show that? Well, if the burial site of Jesus were known in Jerusalem, as we know that it was, because it was Joseph of Arimathea who buried him, then it would be impossible for Christianity at that time to flourish. Christianity was founded on the belief that a dead man rose from the dead. If all Jerusalem was to if they were able to just go and look at the tomb and see Jesus there in the tomb, then Christianity could not have become popular. By the time Jesus' followers began preaching his resurrection, the tomb must have at that point been emptied. Number 2, B, the empty tomb story is also recorded in multiple early independent accounts. Again, with both that pre-Mark Passion story and with the historical tradition we see with Paul dating to just 5 years after the burial. C, Mark's story of the empty tomb is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. To understand this point and to appreciate it, we can look at other legendary tales of the empty tomb story, and merely by comparing them, we can see what fake looks like versus what real looks like. And so, well after the apostles die, there were stories written about Jesus' death and resurrection, and these stories, they were forgeries, they were fakes, and they were written trying to trick people into thinking that they were scripture. And the authors of these, they wanted to tag along their writings with the Bible. And as we look at this, remember my point about how good evidence does not become bad evidence just because time has passed since that evidence was made. Well, I did also point out that if a lot of time goes by between an event happening and then that event being recorded, that actually does go to somewhat discredit that evidence. And that is the case with these forgeries that were written well after all the eyewitnesses died, which are clearly false. We can clearly see by just reading these how false they are. And then by comparing these false forgeries to, say, Mark's account, we can tell that Mark's account has that unavoidable flavor of realism that truth so often has. It has an element of simplicity. Mark's account has an element of simplicity and boringness to it, to the discovery of the empty tomb. For example, in the so-called Gospel according to Peter, which was a forgery, Jesus' tomb was guarded not only by soldiers, by the Roman soldiers, but by the Pharisees and the chief priests, as well as a large crowd from the surrounding land. And then suddenly in the gospel, according to the gospel of Peter, which is a forgery, suddenly in the night, a loud voice rings out from heaven, and then the stone rolls itself away. It was not rolled away by anyone else. It rolls itself away, and then two angels descend from heaven and enter the tomb. Then the two angels leave the tomb, but when they leave, they have become giant, so large that their heads are reaching into the clouds. And then after they leave the tomb, a third, even larger figure, seemingly Jesus, leaves after them, and he is even larger. His head is not just in the clouds, but above the clouds. And then after he leaves, then a cross comes out after that, and then the cross has a conversation with that original voice from heaven. And now these are what legends look and sound like. Look at the contradictions between this forged gospel account and the actual account. You can look at all the contradictions. For example, there is no record that the cross was ever placed in the grave in the actual record. And so if we compare that legendary tale with the simple account given in the Gospel of Mark, it's clear that Mark, he was not just making up a fun little story, but he was recording events as they actually happened. He was recording events. He was recording the event that the tomb was found empty as it actually happened. The next line of evidence for that is that women's testimony at the time in first century Israel was not trustworthy. It was not seen as credible. And that actually in and of itself gives credibility to Mark's claim that the tomb was found empty by women. The gospel authors, they were writing historical facts. They were not writing and inventing myths about, just some random people who found an empty tomb. If they were trying to come up with a myth and they were trying to trick the world into believing that the tomb was found empty, they would have said that it was men who found the empty tomb, not women, because men were seen as trustworthy and women were not seen as trustworthy. Josephus, he actually said that the testimony of women at the time was so distrusted that if there was a woman who was an eyewitness to a crime, say a crime of murder, her testimony would not even be heard in a criminal trial because that is how little women were trusted at the time. And so if the biblical authors, if they were trying to trick the world, there is zero chance that they would have made up this idea that it was women who found the empty tomb. This just goes to show that they only cared about reporting the truth, not reporting what they would have thought might be persuasive, and they were not recording what they thought might trick the public. They were just recording what was true. They were remaining faithful to the truth. And so to all the liberals out there, hashtag believe all women. And of course, whenever you go to a public restroom, the men's bathroom, it should always be on the left because women are always right. And so the Christian faith rests on the testimony of women. So much for the idea that Christianity is misogynistic. The next line of evidence for this is that there was a Jewish allegation against Christians saying that Christians stole Jesus' body. Of course, Christians, they would not have been accused of stealing Jesus' body from the tomb if the body was still in the tomb. The tomb, it was found empty. And so those who hated Christians, those who wanted to reject Christ, they wanted to come up with an explanation for this. So they accused the Christians and they said, "You have stolen Jesus' corpse. You have stolen it." And their own accusations prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the tomb was found empty. They would not have accused these people of stealing a corpse if the corpse was still right there. Number 3, this is the third thing which everyone agrees on. On different occasions, different groups of people experienced and recorded interactions with Jesus after his recorded death and burial. Now, it's going to blow you away to learn that this fact is universally agreed on by New Testament scholars, Christians, and secular scholars alike, for the following three reasons. A, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection's appearance, which is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians, guarantees that such an appearance occurred. This included appearances to Peter, to the 12, and to the 500 brethren, and to James, Jesus' younger brother. A quick brief aside here. If this is a lie that Jesus, he appeared to these people, and all these people are just keeping this lie, it is a very well-kept, brilliant, and impressive lie. I want to read you guys something from Chuck Colson. If you're not familiar with Chuck Colson, let me read you his introduction from Wikipedia. Charles Wendell Colson, who he lived from October 16th, 1931 to April 21st, 2012, generally referred to as Chuck Colson, was an American attorney and political advisor who served as special counsel to President Richard Nixon from 1969 to 1970. Once known as President Nixon's hatchet man, Colson gained notoriety at the height of the Watergate scandal for being named as one of the Watergate Seven, and also for pleading guilty to obstruction of justice for attempting to defame Pentagon Papers defendant Daniel Ellsberg. And here is what he said. So this guy, he got a lot of trouble for Watergate. He was one of the people trying to cover it up. He was one of the top head people involved in that. And here's what he said. He said, quote, "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me." How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it were not true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they could not keep a lie for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep a lie for 40 years? Absolutely impossible, end quote. And now it wasn't just the 12, but it was also the 500 who Jesus appeared to. And we think that there's any possible chance those 500 people could have kept this lie under wraps for the rest of their lives for the next 40 to 50 years. Absolutely ridiculous. So the man in charge of keeping a lie for the White House, the best liar, the best liar of liars in charge of keeping Watergate under wraps, he couldn't do it for 3 weeks. Yet we think that these 500 and some odd uneducated individuals could coordinate this lie and keep it until their deaths. In the words of Chuck Colson, absolutely impossible. B, the appearances were recorded by multiple independent people from different perspectives. There's the appearance to Peter, which is recorded independently by Luke. There is the appearance to the 12, which is recorded independently by both Luke and John. We also have independent witnesses of the appearance to the Galileans in Mark, Matthew, and John. And then we also have the appearance to the woman, to the women recorded in both Matthew and John. Then also, as we discussed in our show series, in our episode, I believe it was the first episode in this show series, the actions of Jesus' followers, including his own family, changed dramatically after his death and after his supposed appearance to them. Before his crucifixion, they were terrified to die for his sake. Then after Jesus rose and appeared to them, they all became willing to be tortured and put to death to defend what they thought was the truth, that Jesus rose from the dead. What could have possibly caused them to do this complete 180 turnaround? What could have possibly caused that? Well, an appearance of a man who you believed to be dead might do exactly that. Now, Dominic Enyart, I have 6 older brothers. I'm the youngest of 7. What do you think it would take for me to believe that one of them was actually God incarnate? What would that take to get me to believe that? What would it take to convince me of that? Well, it would take a lot, but a pretty darn good starting place would be if one of them was pronounced dead, was buried. I watched them get buried, and then they rose again and then appeared to me. If they did that, that would be a pretty good starting place to convince me, my brother, there's something special about him. And that would definitely cause me to change my actions significantly. Number 4, the original disciples believed that Jesus was alive, despite the fact that they also believed every piece of evidence pointing to his death. And think about the situation that they faced following his crucifixion. Their leader was dead. Their Messiah, who was supposed to overthrow their enemies, he was dead. And so it seemed as if Jesus had failed. He wasn't supposed to fail, but he had. B, according to Jewish law, Jesus' execution as a criminal, it proved to them that he was a heretic. Jewish law, it showed that the one who is put to death like this is cursed by God. And that's written in Deuteronomy 21:23. And Deuteronomy, that was written by Moses. Moses was the lawgiver. And Deuteronomy 21:23 says, "For a hanged man is cursed by God." And so Jesus, he was a hanged man, and so presumably he was cursed by God. The crucifixion of Christ showed the apostles at the time, not that they just had to be sad because their leader had died, but that the Jewish leadership was correct. Jesus could not have been hung on a tree as he was, because if that had happened, that would mean that he was cursed by God and they had been following a heretic for years. And so the disciples at that time, that's what they were having to process. That's what they were having to go through. They were realizing, this guy we were following, maybe he wasn't the Christ. Continuing from there, Jewish beliefs said that no one could rise from the dead before the resurrection that would take place at the end of the world. Remember, Jesus' followers, they were Jewish, so they would have believed that as well. All they could do at this point, all that they could do was try to preserve their master's tomb as a shrine. And then until that day, when perhaps at the end of the world, there would be this massive resurrection and they could be reunited with Christ. But believing in all of that as devout Jews, despite every piece of evidence to the contrary, despite believing every piece of evidence that Jesus had died, that they were all sad, they were mourning, despite all of that, they also believed that Jesus was alive. So they believed that he was dead, and they believed that he was alive. And even secular historians and secular scholars believe that the disciples thought both of these things. And so that especially is because those disciples, they were willing to go to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead. And now, all things considered, all of these 4 points, which everyone agrees on, all of these things considered, it is impossible to explain the significant, massive, unparalleled rise of Christianity, the growth of the early Christian church to such a significant degree if Jesus did not actually rise from the dead. That is a historical fact. And so, in summary, we have these 4 points that are agreed on by all New Testament scholars, including anti-Christian and secular scholars. These 4 points, just in recap, are: One, after Jesus' crucifixion, he was buried in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. That's point one. Point two, on the Sunday morning following Jesus' burial, his tomb was found empty by his female followers. Number three, on different occasions, different groups of people experienced and recorded interactions with Jesus after his recorded death and burial. And number four, the original disciples believed that Jesus was alive, despite the fact that they also believed every piece of evidence pointing to his death. And now we have some common ground to work with between the unbeliever and believer alike. The question then becomes, what is the best possible explanation for these four universally agreed on facts? And this is where the disagreement comes in. Most secular scholars, they choose to remain agnostic on the topic. They don't want to give an answer. They just want to say, oh, we just don't know. Or they believe that Jesus' tomb was robbed by the early Christians. This theory that the tomb was robbed is silly because, of course, as we said, all that they could do at this point to show their love of Jesus and to honor their master would have been to best preserve his tomb for the end of days, which clearly robbing his grave would not accomplish that. So that is the silly, scholarly alternative to the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. There's also the idea that there was a mass delusion or mass hallucination that tricked all of these people into believing the exact same falsehood down to the most minute detail, which that theory is also silly for a variety of reasons. That theory is so silly that it's been so largely debunked that it's not even really believed by any of these secular scholars, primarily because that's not how hallucinations work. And even if that's how hallucinations did work, how could a hallucination how could they have all gotten it at the exact same time, and then because of that hallucination, they all hallucinated the exact same thing and recorded it independently, each one of them, all down to the most minute detail? It's not possible. There is zero chance of that. It's not, one in a Googleplex chance. No, it's not. It's 0% chance, zero possible. It's not 0.00001% possibility that this happened. It's zero chance, zero possibility. It is completely and utterly disregardable. It makes no sense. And so those are kind of the three worldly, secular ways to make these four pieces of facts fit. One is that, it was the tomb was robbed by Christians. One was that, it was a hallucination. And one is that, we just don't know. So those are the secular options. Whereas the Christians, however, the Christian option is that, we take a look at these and we say, you know what? The very best possible explanation of all the facts is the one that the original disciples gave, that God has raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus' death and resurrection account for from the disciples, that account from the disciples of his death and resurrection, that explains all of these facts. It fits so beautifully. It explains that he was buried by Joseph. It explains why his tomb was found empty. It explains why there are recordings of him interacting with people after his death and burial. And it explains why the disciples would believe that he was alive even after they believed that he had died. It explains how the Christian faith came to be. It explains how it grew so quickly. It just so perfectly fits all of the evidence available. And there really is no other alternative that so perfectly fits all the facts. There was a man who debated William Lane Craig, and I'm getting most of this info from Craig today. And again, I'll link to his video on this. Excellent video. And Craig, he debated a man who said, I believe all four of those facts. All four of those facts are undeniable. I cannot deny them. Yet here's my theory. My theory is that when Jesus was born, he had an identical twin brother, and he was separated from Jesus at birth. And then when Jesus died, his brother came, stole his body, disposed of it, and then presented himself to the disciples as Jesus, and he fooled them. That's this guy's theory. That is the silliness that people will go to, the absolute absurdity that people are willing to go to try and reject the clear evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And that is why I said at the beginning of the show that this issue of the resurrection, it's not primarily a logical disagreement of the evidence, a logical disagreement of the conclusions, but it is an issue of pride. And that is why we must suspend our pride and accept the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And now, believing in God, believing that he exists, and believing that he raised Jesus from the dead is not enough. That is not enough. James says, you believe that there is one God, you do well, yet even the demons believe and shudder. And demons, if you didn't catch, demons, they aren't saved, if you missed that. So believing, that's not enough, but we must listen to Paul when he says in Romans chapter 10, he says that if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So confession, maybe a better translation of that is professing. So we have to profess Jesus and believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And then Paul explains, for with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So both believe in your heart and profess Jesus is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Hey, that is going to do it for me here today. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell for a really exciting announcement. We've got something big coming out on the Dominic Enyart YouTube channel. Christmas Day, Christmas morning, it's coming. So make sure to keep your eyes peeled for that. That should be really, really cool, really big, really exciting. You guys are going to love this, and it fits in so perfectly with what we're talking about here. Also, hey, kgov.com/store to get a product, to make a donation. That helps keep us on air. Hey, may the Lord bless you, and may he make his face to shine upon you.